The room smelled of beeswax and old paper, and the particular kind of silence that assembles itself before a verdict. Eleanor Voss stood at the near end of the solicitor's table, with her hands folded at her waist and her eyes on the document that Mr. Aldwych had spread before the assembled company. She had worn her plainest morning gown for this occasion, the black spencer buttoned to the throat, because she had understood when she dressed that morning that she would need every scrap of composure she possessed, and none of it could be spent on her appearance. The men arranged around the table were not looking at her. They were looking at the document. She was looking at it, too. She had looked at it for 4 days. The signature at the bottom of the 3rd page was rendered in her own distinctive hand, or something very close to it, the upward slope of the capital E. The particular way the letters of her surname compressed slightly toward the right margin. Whoever had produced it had studied her carefully, and she felt the violation of that study in a way she could not yet put into words. It was not her name, it was a performance of her name, and the performance was almost perfect. Mr. Aldwych cleared his throat and reached for his pen. She said, "That signature is mine. Forged." The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. Mr. Reginald Voss, seated at the far end of the table with his hands resting on his considerable middle, went very still. Lady Corinna Ashby, positioned just behind his right shoulder as though she were a second appointed by the seconds, turned to regard Eleanor with an expression that had not quite settled on condescension, but was moving in that direction. The Earl of Pendwick, who had been standing near the window with his back to the room and his attention ostensibly on the frost-gray parkland beyond the glass, turned his head. He did not speak. He watched. "Mrs. Voss," said Mr. Plex. Aldwych, with the particular gentleness of a man who wished very much to be somewhere else, "if you would perhaps sit down, we might examine this claim in a more orderly fashion." "I am quite orderly," Eleanor said. "I am telling you that I did not sign this document. I am telling you that the signature on the 3rd page is not mine, and I am asking that the transfer of Asherton Hall be suspended until the matter is properly examined." No one moved. The fire in the grate on the far wall was the only thing in the room, with any warmth to it. She had come a long way in the past 8 months to standing in this room and saying those words aloud. It is worth understanding how long the road had been and how much had already been taken from her before she arrived at it. Edmund Voss had died in the 1st week of October, and Eleanor had buried him in the churchyard of St. Cuthbert's on a grey morning when the elms along the lane were just beginning to release their leaves. They had been married 4 years. She had been 23 when she came to Asherton, not quite pretty enough for the season that had produced her, with a modest portion and a father who had run through the larger part of it before he too died. Edmund had not required beauty or money. He had required someone steady. He had told her once, with the plainness of a man who did not speak in decorative phrases, and he had found her steady. She had found him in return more than she expected. He was a man of wit and genuine warmth, beneath a manner the world called reserved. A man who had pressed her hand on the day of her father's funeral and said nothing, because he understood that nothing was what she needed. Asherton Hall itself was not a great estate. 300 acres of Wiltshire farmland, a house that was handsome without being grand, a library that had been Edmund's true inheritance, and that Eleanor had come to love almost as he had. The entail, which had been the property of the Voss family for 2 generations, ran to the male line in the oldest possible arrangement, and Edmund had known when they married that if they had no sons, the estate would pass eventually to his cousin Reginald. Edmund had also known and had told Eleanor plainly in the last year of his life when his health began to fail that his intentions were for her to remain at Asherton for the duration of her widowhood with full use of the property. He had put those intentions in a letter, though he had not. It seemed, put them into a legal instrument that would withstand challenge. Reginald Voss had arrived at Asherton 11 days after the funeral, with a solicitor of his own choosing, and a signed statement that the estate passed to him on Edmund's death. Eleanor's own solicitor, a careful man named Beckwith, who practiced in Bath and whom Edmund had trusted, had written to say that the entail was valid, that the estate would indeed pass to Reginald, and that the question of the dower arrangement would need to be separately adjudicated. This was painful but not unexpected. What had not been in anyone's letters was the document that Mr. Culpton Aldwych produced 6 weeks later, bearing what appeared to be Eleanor's signature on a deed of relinquishment, a document by which she formally surrendered any claim to dower rights or continued residence, a document that if valid would leave her with nothing but her mourning gown and the contents of her writing case. She had not signed it. She had never seen it before the morning. It was produced. She had, however, studied it very carefully for 4 days, and then she had dressed in her plainest gown and come to this room. Julian Carew, Earl of Pendwick, had come to Asherton 3 weeks before the reading in the solicitor's chamber, and his arrival had not been announced in advance. He had known Edmund Voss from their years at Oxford, and he had, he said, been abroad when Edmund died, and had only recently learned of it. He came to pay his respects to the widow, which was the conventional reason, and Eleanor had received him in the drawing-room and offered him tea, because that was what one did, and had watched him carefully, because she had learned in the months since Edmund's death to watch everyone carefully. He was not what she expected from the name, which carried with it a certain kind of reputation. The Earl of Pendwick was understood in the county to be cold, to be exacting, to be the sort of man who arrived at a conclusion without appearing to have moved toward it. In person, he was simply precise. He asked exact questions. He looked at her when she answered, not past her, not at the fire or the window, but at her specifically, with gray eyes that held their attention without warmth or hostility. When she refilled the tea herself because the footman was slow, he did not comment on it, which was unusual. Most visitors to Asherton since Edmund's death had found some way to comment on the reduced household. When she mentioned that Reginald had begun an inventory of the library, his mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "The entail does not transfer the library contents," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "I have pointed that out." What was the response? "That I am mistaken," she said. She said it evenly, which required some effort, and he appeared to notice the effort because he set his teacup down with a slight deliberateness that read, in the grammar of very controlled men, as something close to feeling, "Mr. Beegis." Voss chose that moment to appear at the drawing-room door on some pretext involving the inventory. He spoke to Eleanor across the room in the tone of a man who has already decided the outcome, and when he departed, Eleanor heard him in the corridor just outside the door, his voice lowered for Lady Corinna, who had arrived 2 days prior, and whom Eleanor suspected had not come for any reason that would benefit her. "Her grief has disordered her reason a little," Reginald said, just audible through the half-open door. "She makes claims. One must be patient." She did not move. She did not alter her expression. She was aware, in the way one becomes aware of something without meaning to, that the Earl of Pendwick was watching her face, and that he had heard it too. He stayed 3 days, ostensibly out of courtesy. During those 3 days he appeared at intervals in rooms she was occupying, asked to see the library, asked to be shown the property boundary, asked one morning, over the breakfast table, about the original entail instrument. He did not explain his questions. When she asked on the second day whether he intended to take Reginald's side in the matter of her residence, he looked at her steadily for a moment before answering. "I have not taken anyone's side," he said. "I am in the habit of forming my own opinions." She wanted to believe him. She did not, quite, but she filed his words away, as she filed most things, carefully and without sentiment. The library was where she did her best thinking, and it was in the library on the evening of the second day that Reginald's man came to find her. He was a round, sweating man named Fitch, who had served Reginald in some administrative capacity for several years, and he came with an envelope that he set on the library table beside her. Inside the envelope were £40 and a brief note, unsigned, that suggested Mrs. Voss might find Bath more congenial to her recovery than continued residence at Asherton, and that the financial assistance enclosed was offered in the spirit of Christian charity and not in any way connected to the ongoing legal arrangements. Eleanor picked up the envelope. She put it back down on the table. She looked at Fitch. "Tell Mr. Voss," she said, "that if he wishes me to leave, he will need to provide a legal instrument compelling my departure. And tell him that the document currently being prepared for that purpose will not serve." Fitch blinked. He retrieved the envelope and backed out of the room. She did not know, until much later, that the Earl had been standing in the doorway behind Fitch, returned from a late walk along the park boundary. She did not know that he had heard all of it, including the quality of her voice, which had not wavered. She learned it only because he told her, in the autumn, and the telling of it surprised her more than anything that had come before. She had not thought she was being observed. She had only been being herself, which was the thing she was best at, and which had, in the past 8 months, seemed the most insufficient currency imaginable. That evening, after Fitch was gone, and the library was quiet again, the Earl returned to the doorway. He had changed from his riding coat to his dinner coat, the navy tailcoat, precisely fitted at the shoulder, the white cravat exactly knotted. He stood a moment in the light of the 2 candles she had burning at the library table. "I am sorry to intrude," he said. "I had come to return a volume I borrowed from the 3rd shelf." "You did not borrow anything," Eleanor said without looking up from her papers. A pause. "No," he said. "I did not." He came in anyway, and sat in the opposite chair, which was what Edmund used to call the reading chair, and which no one else had sat in since October. She looked up at that. He had the expression of a man who knows he has done something and has decided not to apologize for it. She asked him, because it seemed the only honest thing to do, why he had really come to Asherton. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the same plainness Edmund had sometimes managed, "I had a wife once. Her name was Cecilia. Her brother presented a claim on her inheritance during the first year of our marriage while I was abroad. I was told by my own solicitor that the matter was in hand." He paused. "It was not in hand. By the time I returned, the claim had been validated and the inheritance transferred." Cecilia died 3 years later, in circumstances that were materially diminished from those she had deserved. He looked at the fire. "I arrived too late. I will not make that particular mistake again." She held herself very still. The candle between them was burning unevenly, tilting in some draught from the chimney. She watched his profile in the unsteady light and did not speak, because there was nothing adequate to say and they both knew it. He did not stay long after that. He said good night and left the library, and Eleanor sat alone for a long time with the letter she had found that afternoon in Edmund's writing case. A letter dated the 14th of July, 3 months before his death, in Edmund's own distinct compressed hand, which she knew as well as her own. And she thought about what he had told her and what he had not told her, and whether the distinction was meaningful. She was still thinking about it 4 days later, when she stood at the solicitor's table and said that her signature was forged. The days between the Earl's departure and the day of the reading had not been kind ones. Reginald had moved with the confidence of a man who had constructed his plan carefully and been assured by those who knew about these things that it would hold. Lady Karina had positioned herself at Asherton in the role of gracious facilitator, entertaining the local families who came to call, sitting at the head of the dining table with the ease of a woman who believed she was already there by right, presiding over the drawing room with a warmth calibrated precisely to the people she wished to impress, and a coolness calibrated equally precisely to Eleanor. In the second week, she made the dismissive remark in the drawing room, with 4 women from the county families assembled for an afternoon call, in a tone of tender concern that did not remotely conceal its purpose. Poor Mrs. Deller. "Voss," she said, as though Eleanor were not in the room. "One does not like to say it, but her grief has disordered her reason. She disputes everything, even documents bearing her own name. One can only hope that with time and some appropriate support, she will recover herself." The 4 county women looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back at them, very quietly, and no one in the room could have said from her face that she had heard anything at all. She had, however, heard everything. She had also on the afternoon of the reading written a short note to the Earl of Pendwick at his London address, and enclosed within it a careful copy of the signature she disputed, and a single sentence in which she told him that she believed he knew something of this matter, and that she was asking him to look at it. She sent it, with Thomas, the most reliable of the remaining footmen. She did not know whether it would reach the Earl in time. She did not know whether the Earl would act on it. She knew only that she had said what she had to say in the solicitor's chamber, and that no one in the room had yet responded. Aldwych was explaining with elaborate care that the document had been witnessed by two parties and bore every outward characteristic of a valid instrument. Reginald was nodding, with the patience of a man who expects to be vindicated momentarily. Lady Corinna had composed her face into an expression of measured sympathy directed at Eleanor. 3 other men sat at the table as well. A junior solicitor, a land agent, and a banker, who had some involvement in the property accounts. Mr. Aldwych concluded by saying that he understood Mrs. Gatters. Voss was in some distress, and that the office would of course receive any formal challenge through the proper legal channels, and that in the meantime the transfer of title would proceed as scheduled on the following Tuesday. Eleanor said nothing further. She had said what she had to say. She gathered her gloves from the table and walked out of the solicitor's chamber and into the gray November afternoon, and Mr. Aldwich's voice followed her as far as the door. "I had heard from Mr. Voss that you were perhaps not entirely yourself, Mrs. Voss. One does understand how grief can press upon a lady's faculties." He had heard it from Reginald. She understood that. She walked to the waiting carriage anyway, and she sat inside it, with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and she looked at the frost on the carriage window and thought about Edmund's letter, which was folded inside her bodice where she had placed it that morning because she had not known what else to do with it. The estate formally changed hands on Tuesday, as Mr. Aldwych had said it would. Eleanor received the notice at 10 in the morning in the form of a brief letter delivered by Reginald's man, Fitch, who had the grace not to meet her eyes. She was to vacate the hall by the end of the fortnight. Her personal belongings would be preserved for her removal. The library was not to be disturbed until the inventory was complete, by which she understood that nothing in the library was hers to take. She sat in the morning room with the letter in her hands and permitted herself exactly 5 minutes of stillness that was not composure, but its absence. The morning room had been hers, in a way the drawing room had never been. Smaller and south-facing and full of the particular afternoon light she had liked. Edmund had given her the bureau in the corner on their second winter, knowing she preferred to write at the window, and she had sat in this room through the slow months of his illness and through the worse weeks after, and she had understood the room as a kind of anchor. Now it was not hers. The letter in her hand said so, in the particular impersonal language of legal instruments, which is to say, it said so without any acknowledgement that it was speaking to a person. Then she took Edmund's letter from the place she had been keeping it, and read it through once more as she had read it, perhaps 20 times since finding it. Edmund wrote in a hand that was unmistakably his. The particular compression of his letters, the way his T-bars crossed slightly high, the tendency of his final letters to trail upward. The letter addressed her by her first name, which he rarely did in writing, and it spoke of his intentions clearly. It was not a legal document. It could not overturn the transfer. It was, however, something else, something she did not yet have words for. Evidence of who he had been, and of what a real signature from his household looked like, and of the distance between genuine expression and careful imitation. She folded it. She put on her outdoor things and went to find Thomas. The Earl of Pendwick arrived at Asherton the following morning. Eleanor was in the library when Mrs. Paget came to tell her, and she had to set down the inventory list she had been compiling of what the library legitimately contained before she could trust her face enough to enter the hall. He was standing in the entrance as he had stood before without announcing himself as anything other than exactly what he was, and he looked at her across the hall with an expression that had changed since the last time she had seen him, though she could not yet identify how. "Your note reached me," he said. "I did not know whether it would be in time. It was not necessary," he said. "I had already sent for my own legal man." She looked at him. He had already sent for his own legal man. She parsed the meaning of that, the timeline it implied, the care it required, and something in her chest contracted in a way that was not grief. He came into the library and sat in the reading chair, which was now simply a chair, and she sat opposite, and he placed before her two documents. The first was a letter from a man named Stanhope, who was apparently a document examiner with a practice in Lincoln's Inn, and whom the Earl's solicitor had engaged without mentioning the specific matter until the specimens were received. The second was Stanhope's assessment, which ran to 3 careful pages, and concluded that the signature on the deed of relinquishment was consistent with a studied imitation of Mrs. Keeney. Eleanor Voss's habitual letter forms, but inconsistent in 6 specific identified respects with authenticated samples of her writing, 3 of which he listed in detail. She read it through twice. "This will hold," she said. It was not a question. "With Edmund's letter as additional support for your authenticated hand," he said. "Yes. Mr. Stanhope is prepared to testify." She put the documents down on the table and was quiet for a moment. Outside the library window, the late November parkland was bare and cold, the elms reduced to their winter architecture, the grass pale. She had looked at this view every morning for 4 years, and she had not, until this moment, been entirely certain she would continue to look at it. "I want to understand," she said. "You engaged Mr. Stanhope before my note reached you?"
Yes.
"Before the transfer?" "Before the transfer." She looked at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I stood in a library doorway," he said, "and watched you refuse £40 and 3 months rent-free in Bath, and I knew then that you had not signed anything you did not mean to sign. And I had left Cecilia's matter too long in the hands of people who were being paid to let it go too long." He paused. "I was not inclined to repeat that. The silence between them was different from the silences that had come before it. She was aware of the fire behind her and the cold glass to her left, and the particular quality of the November light, and she was aware of him in the reading chair with his hands resting quietly on the arms of it, and his gray eyes on her face. And she permitted herself very briefly to understand what she had not yet allowed herself to understand, which was that he had been watching her since the afternoon he arrived, and that the watching had been something more than practical observation. She said, "Edmund would have liked you, I think. He said he told me you were the steadiest person he had ever known." She looked away because it was necessary. The fire was doing something interesting behind the grate. She heard him, in the chair, make a small sound that was not quite anything she could name. After a moment, she looked back. "When is the second reading?" she said. "Friday," he said. "Mr. Aldwich's chambers." "I have requested the same assembly." She straightened her back and folded her hands, which was not composure this time, but something firmer than composure. "Then we should prepare," she said. The second reading in Mr. Prauld's. Aldwich's chambers on the Friday was not announced in advance to Reginald, which was the Earl's deliberate choice and which Eleanor had agreed with when he explained his reasoning. They arrived together, which itself was a statement, though neither of them remarked on it. Reginald and Lady Corinna were already present, having been summoned by Mr. Aldwich on grounds the solicitor had been carefully vague about. Mr. Pastor's lad. Stanhope sat at the corner of the table with his 3 pages of assessment and a set of specimens he had prepared. The junior solicitor, the land agent, and the banker were also present, as were 2 additional witnesses the Earl had brought. A retired magistrate named Hartley, who held no brief in the matter, but whose presence in a room made proceedings feel more consequential, and Mr. Stanhope's assistant. Reginald's eyes moved to Eleanor the moment she entered. Then they moved to the Earl. Then they moved back to Eleanor, and something in them shifted, though his expression did not. Lady Corinna said very graciously that she had not expected Mrs. Voss to bring company. "Mr. Wark, Stanhope is not company," Eleanor said. "He is a document examiner from Lincoln's Inn. He has prepared an assessment that I believe Mr. Aldwich will find relevant." "Surely," Lady Corinna said, addressing the room with the air of a woman who knows the room belongs to her. "We have established that the poor woman's grief has disordered her judgment sufficiently that her claims require some sympathy rather than legal attention." Reginald was very still. Mr. Aldwich opened his mouth. Julian Carew stepped forward from behind Eleanor's left shoulder, which was not where she had known he was standing, and said, in a voice that was level and not raised, "The signature on the document before this assembly is not Mrs. Tampour." Voss's hand. The room absorbed this. "My lord," said Reginald, "I am not certain you have the standing to offer an opinion on the matter." "Mr. Stanhope has the standing," the Earl said. "I have his assessment, and I have the authenticated specimens, and I have arranged for the matter to be placed before the court, if this body finds itself unable to act on the evidence here assembled. I have also spoken this morning with Sir George Hallam, who sits on the circuit on the subject of forged instruments and the penalties attached to their use in transfer of property." He looked at Reginald directly. Sir George is a thorough man. The silence was of a different quality now. Reginald looked at Lady Corinna. Lady Corinna did not look back at him. No one contradicted him. The silence that followed his declaration was of the type that assembles itself when a room full of people understand simultaneously that something they believe to be settled is not settled, and that what comes next will require of each of them a response they had not prepared. Reginald's hands were still on the table. Lady Corinna's fan had opened and not moved. The retired magistrate Hartley had folded his arms with the air of a man who has attended many such assemblies and finds this one among the less surprising. Mr. Stanhope spoke for 11 minutes. He was a thin, dry man who had spent 30 years examining documents and had the manner of someone who found everything he was asked to examine mildly interesting and everything outside his specimens entirely irrelevant. He laid his specimens on the table. He indicated the 6 points of inconsistency. He used language that was precise and clear and entirely damning, and when he finished he collected his specimens back into their folder and sat down, and the room was very quiet. Mr. Aldwych looked at the specimens for a long time. Then he looked at Reginald. Reginald's hands were still on the table. Lady Corinna had opened her fan and then closed it again, which was the only movement she made. The retired magistrate Hartley cleared his throat once, which was not nothing. "Mrs. Voss," said Mr. Aldwych slowly, "do you wish to state formally that the signature on the deed of relinquishment is not yours?" "I do," Eleanor said. "It has never been mine." "I see," said Mr. Aldwych. He said it the way a man says something when he has understood a great deal more than the words themselves, and does not yet know how to absorb it. He looked at Reginald again. Reginald did not speak. Something in his face had gone the color of January. Lady Corinna said into the silence, "This is all quite excessive. One does not expect quite this level of—" She paused. "Disruption." Her voice was still smooth, but it was smooth the way ice is smooth in the moment, before it shows the crack beneath. "The transfer of title," the Earl said, "will need to be reversed and the matter referred for formal inquiry. Mrs. Diam, Voss has been dispossessed on the basis of a document that does not bear her signature. Mr. Aldwych, I believe you know what is required." Mr. Aldwych knew what was required. He was, in the end, a careful man who had been given a forged document by a party he had trusted, and who did not, now that the evidence was before him, wish to be found on the wrong side of the inquiry that would follow. He was already reaching for his pen. The movement was almost gratitude. Reginald stood. He said something brief that no one later remembered precisely. Then he walked out of the chamber, and Fitch, who had been waiting in the corridor, fell in behind him, and Lady Corinna remained seated for a moment longer than was comfortable, before rising with great dignity, and departing without addressing anyone directly. Eleanor stood at the table and watched them go. She was aware that her hands were not entirely steady. She pressed them flat against the wool of her skirt very briefly, and then she folded them, as she always did, and she looked at the fire in the grate, across the chamber which was burning steadily, and had been all along. She felt the Earl's presence at her left shoulder before she heard him, which was the way it had been since the library doorway. "It will take a week for the papers to be formally reversed," he said quietly. "Not for the room. You should remain at Asherton. There is no legal basis for the notice to vacate." "I know," she said. A pause. he said still quietly. "Eleanor." She turned. He had never used her given name. He had said it now the way a man says a thing he has been holding back for some weeks, and the sound of it in his voice was different from the sound of anything else he had said in all their conversations. And she understood in that moment that the watching had never been purely practical, that it had not been practical at all, and that he had known it longer than she had. She looked at him. His expression was the controlled expression of a man who has done everything necessary and has arrived at a point where control is no longer the tool required. "Yes," she said. Simply that. Because it was the only honest answer, and she had learned in the past 8 months to be honest when honesty was all she had. Mrs. Paget was waiting in the entrance hall at Asherton when Eleanor returned that afternoon, which was a thing Mrs. Paget had done in some form or other through every difficulty of the past 8 months, and the sight of her broad, capable figure in the familiar hall was the thing that finally released something Eleanor had been holding very tightly for a very long time. She did not weep. She stood in the hall and she breathed, and Mrs. Paget said, "I'll have the library fire going, ma'am," as though nothing had ever been otherwise, and went to see to it. Eleanor followed her through the quiet house. The library was as she had left it. The fire came up quickly, as fires do in rooms that have been recently inhabited, and the warm light moved across the shelves and the books and the worn leather of the reading chair, which she had stopped thinking of as Edmund's chair some weeks ago and had not yet decided what else to call it. She sat in it anyway, because she was tired, and because it faced the fire, and because the light was very gentle. Edmund's letter was in the inside pocket of her Spencer jacket, where she had kept it through the reading, and the journey and all the rest of it. She took it out and unfolded it and read it once more, not because she needed to, but because it was his hand and his words, and there was comfort in both. He had written near the end of it that the steadiest foundation he knew was not any property or instrument or legal arrangement, but Eleanor herself, and that he was grateful to have built his last years on that foundation. She had read this many times. It still did not quite land. The way ordinary sentences landed, she set the letter on the table beside her and looked at the fire. The Earl arrived an hour later, having ridden from the village rather than driving, and Mrs. Paget showed him in without apparent surprise, as though his arrival were simply the next logical occurrence in an afternoon that had already been quite full of them. He came into the library and stopped just inside the doorway, and looked at her in the chair, and then at the letter on the table, and he crossed the room and sat opposite her without being invited, which was entirely consistent with everything she knew of him. "Stanhope's full report will be filed by Monday," he said. "The inquiry has been formally initiated." She nodded. Then she said, because she had been thinking about it in the carriage, "You might have told me, when you arrived that morning, that you had already engaged Stanhope. You made it sound as though my note had prompted it." "Your note confirmed what I had already decided," he said. "But I did not want you to feel that the outcome was entirely out of your hands. It seemed important that you understood you had acted, and that your action had mattered." She looked at him for a long moment. "It did matter," she said. "I would have sent the note regardless." "I know," he said. "That was also why it mattered." The fire shifted in the grate. Outside the library window, the November dusk was coming in early, as it did at this time of year. The parkland, going gray, and then darker. The elms along the lane were precisely the same bare winter architecture they had been on the October morning she buried Edmund, and she had thought then, looking at them from the churchyard, that she was looking at something she would not see again. She had been wrong about that, it turned out. She had been wrong about a number of things. She picked up Edmund's letter and folded it again along its worn creases. He did not ask her what she was thinking. He was not a man who asked people what they were thinking. He was a man who waited, and in waiting, communicated something that asking would have reduced. She was grateful for that. She set the letter on the table between them, and she looked at him in the firelight, and he looked at her. And neither of them was in any hurry. The fire burned warm and quiet through the early dark. She had come through 8 months of grief and dispossession and a forgery so carefully constructed that it had nearly succeeded, and she had come through it, she realized, by being precisely what Edmund had said she was. Steady, not unshaken. Steady. And steadiness, it turned out, was not a quality that the world rewarded with ease or with speed, but it was, in the end, a quality that a certain kind of man recognized without needing to be told to look for it. If Eleanor's story has moved you, leave a word for it in the comments. Stories like hers deserve to be remembered. She did not leave Asherton Hall that winter or in the spring that followed it. By the time the snowdrops appeared along the lane in February, the formal inquiry had concluded, the deed of relinquishment had been struck from the record, and Reginald had removed himself from the county in a manner that did not suggest he intended to return. The library remained as it had always been, and the inventory that had never quite been completed remained incomplete, and Mrs. Paget's fires burned in the rooms that needed them each morning as they always had. Edmund's letters stayed in the inside pocket of the black Spencer jacket that Eleanor had begun by spring to wear less often. On a Wednesday evening in March, the Earl of Pendwick arrived at Asherton, not on a matter of legal significance, but for the reason that he had begun, over the winter, to arrive. The library was warm and the conversation was honest, and there was a chair opposite the fire that had been waiting for someone to claim it, and the claiming had turned out to be a quieter and more certain thing than either of them had initially expected. She was reading when he came in. He sat in the chair across from her and did not immediately speak, which was one of the things she had come to understand she valued in him, his ability to be present without requiring the presence to be announced. After a while, he said Stanhope sent his final accounting. Is it satisfactory? Thoroughly. She turned a page. Outside the library window, the March darkness was soft and damp, the smell of turned earth just beginning to come in through the slightly opened sash. The fire was the particular orange of a fire that has been burning long enough to be comfortable rather than merely warm. She thought of Edmund's letter in the jacket pocket and of the morning she had stood at Mr. Brest, Aldwich's table, and said what she had to say, and of all the mornings between that one and this one, which had added up to something she had not been able to see the shape of when she was inside them, but which was legible now in the firelight with the quiet company of a serious man in the chair opposite. She did not say any of this. He would not have required her to. She turned another page, and the fire burned, and the first rain of March came against the library window, in the way rain has always come against old glass, gently and without explanation and as though it had nowhere else it needed to be.